Soviet engineers thought German aircraft designers had committed an unforgivable error, building a frontline fighter with fuel tanks that would explode from a single tracer round. One freezing morning in January 1943, with a captured Focke-Wulf Fw-190 sitting on a test airfield outside Moscow, they discovered something that would shatter everything they believed about aircraft design philosophy. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Pugachev of the Soviet Air Force Research Institute stood before the captured German fighter with a team of engineers, examining the fuel system with growing disbelief. "These tanks have no protection whatsoever," he announced after completing his inspection. "No armor plating, no self-sealing bladders, nothing. One incendiary round and this aircraft becomes a flying bomb." His colleagues shared his confusion, but the story of why German engineers made this seemingly suicidal design choice and what effect it had reveals something profound about engineering trade-offs, tactical doctrine, and the fundamentally different ways nations approach the science of keeping pilots alive. What started as Soviet certainty that they'd discovered a fatal German design flaw would become a revelation that forced them to reconsider their entire approach to fighter design. The cultural and technical context of Soviet versus German fighter design philosophy in 1942 and 1943 was shaped by radically different operational realities and national priorities. Soviet fighters were designed under constraints and assumptions completely unlike those facing German engineers. Understanding these differences is essential to comprehending why the unprotected fuel tanks seemed so incomprehensible to Soviet observers. Soviet fighter design prioritized pilot survival through defensive measures. Soviet aircraft typically featured armored seats, armored headrests, thick armored windscreens, and critically, self-sealing fuel tanks. These self-sealing tanks used rubber bladders that would swell when punctured by bullets, automatically sealing small holes and preventing fuel leakage and fire. This technology added substantial weight, but was considered absolutely essential. The reasoning was straightforward and tragic. Soviet pilots were difficult and time-consuming to train. Losing an aircraft was inconvenient. Losing a trained pilot was catastrophic. The Soviet Union had vast industrial capacity to replace aircraft, but couldn't quickly replace experienced pilots. Therefore, Soviet design philosophy accepted performance penalties from added weight if that weight improved pilot survival odds. German design philosophy, particularly Focke-Wulf's approach under chief designer Kurt Tank, operated from completely different assumptions. German fighters prioritized performance over protection. The reasoning was that superior performance, speed, climb rate, and maneuverability provided the best protection by enabling pilots to dictate combat terms and disengage when threatened. Heavy defensive armor that degraded performance was seen as counterproductive. The Focke-Wulf Fw-190, which entered service in 1941, embodied this philosophy completely. It was designed to be fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed. Everything else was secondary. The fuel tanks were simple aluminum structures without self-sealing bladders or armor protection. This saved hundreds of pounds of weight, which translated directly into superior performance. When the first FW-190s appeared over the Eastern Front in late 1942, Soviet pilots were shocked by the aircraft's performance. It was faster than Soviet fighters at most altitudes. It could outdive anything in the Soviet inventory. Its heavy armament, typically two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns, could destroy Soviet fighters with short bursts. The FW-190 quickly became one of the most feared German fighters on the Eastern Front. Soviet intelligence desperately wanted to examine a captured FW-190 to understand the source of its superior performance. Several aircraft had been shot down over Soviet territory, but most were too damaged for meaningful technical analysis. In January 1943, a relatively intact FW-190A4 made a forced landing behind Soviet lines after sustaining engine damage. The pilot was captured and the aircraft was recovered and transported to the Soviet Air Force Research Institute for examination. Stay with me. We're about to reveal what Soviet engineers discovered when they dismantled this aircraft, and their initial reactions were a mixture of admiration and horror. The technical examination of the captured FW-190 was conducted by a team led by senior engineer Alexander Yakovlev, brother of the famous aircraft designer. The team approached the evaluation systematically, examining every aspect of the German fighter's design. Their detailed report, declassified decades after the war, reveals the profound shock they experienced. The initial inspection focused on the obvious: the aircraft's armament, engine, and flight controls. The BMW 801 radial engine was immediately impressive, displacing 42 litres and producing 1,700 horsepower. It was significantly more powerful than engines in comparable Soviet fighters. The installation was remarkably compact and well-engineered. Cooling was efficient, despite the radial configuration. The engineering quality was exceptional. The armament impressed Soviet evaluators even more. 4 weapons, 2 MG-151/20 cannons in the wing roots, and 2 MG-17 machine guns in the upper fuselage, all synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. The weapons installation was sophisticated, with excellent ammunition capacity and feed reliability. Soviet fighters typically carried lighter armament with less ammunition. The FW-190's firepower advantage was substantial. But when engineers examined the fuel system, their admiration turned to confusion and concern. Engineer Lieutenant Sergei Belov recorded the initial assessment. The fuel tanks are constructed of simple aluminum sheet metal. There is no rubber bladder, no self-sealing capability whatsoever. The tanks are located in the fuselage directly behind the engine and in the wing roots near the landing gear. Both positions are extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. A single incendiary round striking either tank would almost certainly cause catastrophic fire. This design is incomprehensible from a survivability perspective. The fuel capacity was also notable. The FW-190A-4 carried approximately 400 litres of fuel internally, significantly less than comparable Soviet fighters. Combined with the high fuel consumption of the powerful BMW 801 engine, this gave the aircraft limited range and endurance. Soviet fighters typically carried more fuel and had better endurance, which was considered operationally essential on the Eastern Front, where distances were vast and forward airfields were primitive. The Soviet evaluation team conducted a vulnerability analysis, systematically examining what would happen if various aircraft components were struck by typical Soviet weapons. The results for the fuel system were stark. Any incendiary ammunition striking the unprotected fuel tanks would almost certainly cause immediate catastrophic fire. The aircraft would be lost, and pilot survival would be unlikely. By Soviet standards, this was an unacceptable vulnerability that negated any performance advantages. Senior Lieutenant Pugachev summarized the team's initial conclusion in his report to Soviet Air Force headquarters. The FW-190 is an aircraft of contradictions. The engineering quality is exceptional. The performance is superior to our fighters in most regimes, but the vulnerability is shocking. The Germans have sacrificed pilot protection for performance. This may work in the West, where combat is less intense, but on the Eastern Front, this aircraft's lack of protection is a fatal weakness. We do not recommend adopting any design features related to fuel system protection. Soviet self-sealing tanks remain superior, despite weight penalties. This assessment reflected genuine conviction that Soviet design philosophy was correct, but it was based on incomplete understanding of how the FW-190 was actually employed in combat and what tactical doctrine supported its design choices. Hang on. We're about to see how German pilots actually used this supposedly vulnerable aircraft, and the tactical reality was completely different from Soviet assumptions. To understand why the FW-190's unprotected fuel tanks weren't the fatal flaw Soviet engineers assumed, it's essential to examine how German pilots actually flew the aircraft and what tactical doctrine governed its employment. The Germans weren't ignorant of vulnerability. They'd made conscious, calculated trade-offs based on specific tactical approaches. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine for the FW-190 emphasized boom and zoom attacks rather than sustained turning combat. German pilots were trained to use the FW-190's superior speed and dive performance to attack from advantageous positions, typically diving from higher altitude with speed advantage, firing a concentrated burst, then extending away at high speed before Soviet fighters could respond effectively. This tactical approach minimized exposure time. The FW-190 would spend as little time as possible in the vulnerable slow-speed maneuvering regime where Soviet fighters, with their superior turning capability, could bring guns to bear. By maintaining speed and using altitude tactically, German pilots reduced the probability of being hit, regardless of fuel tank protection. Oberleutnant Otto Kittel, who became one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, flying primarily FW-190s on the Eastern Front with 267 confirmed victories, described the tactical approach in post-war interviews. The FW-190's strength was its energy retention and dive performance. We never engaged in slow-turning fights where Soviet fighters had advantages. We would climb above Soviet formations, dive at high speed with the sun behind us, fire from close range where our heavy weapons were devastatingly effective, then extend away climbing. Soviet fighters couldn't catch us if we maintained discipline and speed. The lack of fuel tank protection was irrelevant because we avoided situations where we would be hit. This tactical discipline was crucial. When German pilots violated doctrine and allowed themselves to be drawn into turning combat at low speeds, the FW-190's vulnerabilities became fatal. Several German pilots were killed when Soviet fighters managed to hit their unprotected fuel tanks. But these casualties were attributed to tactical errors, not design flaws. Proper employment of the aircraft minimized vulnerability, despite the unprotected tanks. The FW-190's performance advantages supported this tactical approach perfectly. The aircraft could outdive any Soviet fighter, which meant German pilots always had an escape option if an engagement turned unfavorable. The heavy armament meant that successful attacks required only brief firing opportunities. The excellent visibility from the cockpit helped pilots maintain situational awareness and avoid being surprised. Major Günther Rall, another high-scoring German ace, explained the philosophy. Soviet fighters are protected but slow. They survive hits but can't avoid being hit. German fighters are fast but vulnerable. We avoid being hit through superior performance and tactics. Both approaches can work, but they require completely different tactical employment. The Soviets didn't understand this when they examined captured FW-190s. They evaluated the aircraft through the lens of their own tactical doctrine, which made the design choices seem irrational. Soviet pilots who encountered FW-19s in combat learned to respect the aircraft despite its theoretical vulnerabilities. Soviet ace Alexander Pokryshkin, who developed many of the tactical innovations Soviet fighters used, recognized that the FW-190 had to be engaged on Soviet terms, not German terms. We couldn't allow FW-190 pilots to fight their preferred way, diving from altitude with speed advantage. We developed tactics to deny them altitude advantage, force them into turning combat where our aircraft had advantages, and specifically target their vulnerable fuel systems when we could achieve firing solutions. But was the German approach actually superior, or were they just lucky? Keep watching. We're about to examine the statistical evidence, and the numbers tell a surprising story. The combat effectiveness of the FW-190 on the Eastern Front provides empirical evidence about whether the design philosophy was sound or reckless. Statistical analysis of combat results, while complicated by incomplete and sometimes propagandized records, reveals important patterns. German FW-190 units on the Eastern Front achieved impressive kill ratios against Soviet aircraft throughout 1942 and 1943. Units equipped with FW-190s typically achieved exchange ratios between 5 to 1 and 10 to 1, meaning they destroyed 5 to 10 Soviet aircraft for each FW-190 lost. These ratios were superior to German units flying Bf-19s, which had self-sealing fuel tanks and more defensive armor. The loss analysis is revealing. When FW-19s were lost in combat, the cause of loss distributed across multiple factors: catastrophic structural failure from cannon hits, engine damage, pilot killed or incapacitated, and fuel system fires. Fuel system fires accounted for roughly 20 to 30% of combat losses, significant but not dominant. By comparison, Soviet fighters with protected fuel tanks were still lost at high rates, but from different causes. Soviet aircraft were more likely to survive individual hits, but were hit more frequently because their inferior performance made them easier targets. The protection kept aircraft flying after initial hits, but subsequent hits would eventually cause catastrophic damage. The self-sealing tanks prevented some losses, but didn't provide the decisive advantage Soviet designers assumed. A classified Soviet analysis from 1944, examining combat effectiveness of different design approaches, concluded that performance and tactics mattered more than passive protection. The report stated, German fighters achieve superior exchange ratios not because of better protection, which they lack, but because superior performance enables tactical advantages that reduce exposure to enemy fire. Soviet fighters survive individual hits more frequently, but are hit more frequently due to performance disadvantages. The net result favors German approach in current combat conditions. This conclusion was controversial within Soviet aviation circles. It challenged fundamental assumptions about design priorities. Many Soviet designers and commanders refused to accept that performance could outweigh protection. The cultural commitment to protecting pilots through armor and self-sealing tanks was deeply ingrained. But battlefield results were difficult to ignore. German pilots flying unprotected FW-190s were achieving victory ratios that Soviet pilots in protected aircraft couldn't match. The theoretical vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks wasn't translating into operational disadvantages. German pilots were being killed at lower rates than Soviet pilots, despite flying aircraft that Soviet engineers considered suicidally vulnerable. Major General Georgy Zakharov, who commanded Soviet fighter aviation units, articulated the dilemma in a report to Stalin. The German FW-190 represents a different design philosophy than our aircraft. They prioritize performance over protection. Our analysis suggests their approach is effective in current combat conditions. However, adopting similar approaches would require fundamental changes to our tactical doctrine and pilot training. It would also be politically difficult to explain why we are removing protection from our pilots' aircraft. The political dimension was significant. Soviet propaganda emphasized that Soviet aircraft were superior to German aircraft and that Soviet care for soldiers' lives exceeded fascist disregard for human life. Acknowledging that German design choices that prioritized performance over protection were actually effective would contradict these propaganda narratives. So what did Soviet designers actually do with this uncomfortable knowledge? Stay tuned. The response reveals fascinating tensions between engineering reality and political necessity. Soviet aircraft designers faced a complex problem after analyzing captured FW-190s. The engineering evidence suggested that German design choices were rational and effective, but political and cultural factors made it impossible to directly adopt those approaches. The solution was compromise and innovation that attempted to achieve both performance and protection. Alexander Yakovlev, designer of the Yak series fighters that equipped much of Soviet fighter aviation, was tasked with incorporating lessons from FW-190 analysis while maintaining Soviet design principles. His approach was subtle. Rather than eliminating protection, which was politically impossible, he worked to minimize the performance penalties of protection while maximizing its effectiveness. The Yak-3, which entered service in 1944, represented this compromise. The aircraft retained self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor, but used more advanced materials and designs that reduced weight penalties. The fuel tank bladders used improved rubber compounds that were lighter and more flexible. Armor protection was strategically placed to protect vital areas while minimizing total weight. The result was an aircraft that retained Soviet protective features, but achieved performance much closer to German fighters. Yakovlev explained his philosophy in post-war writings. The FW-190 analysis taught us that protection without performance is insufficient, but abandoning protection entirely was unacceptable, both culturally and practically. The solution was engineering innovation to achieve both. This required better materials, more sophisticated design, and willingness to adopt features we had previously rejected. One specific innovation was adoption of radial engines for some Soviet fighters. Soviet designers had historically preferred inline engines for aesthetic and aerodynamic reasons, but the FW-190's successful use of a radial engine, which was lighter and more damage-resistant than inline engines, demonstrated advantages Soviet designers had overlooked. The Lavochkin La-5 and La-7, which used radial engines, achieved performance competitive with German fighters while retaining Soviet protection features. Another lesson involved fuel system design. While Soviet designers refused to eliminate self-sealing tanks, they redesigned fuel systems to minimize vulnerability. Tanks were repositioned to less exposed locations. Fuel lines were rerouted to reduce exposure. Multiple smaller tanks replaced single large tanks, so damage to one tank wouldn't cause complete fuel loss. These changes improved survivability without requiring abandonment of self-sealing technology. The tactical doctrine also evolved. Soviet pilots were trained in energy fighting techniques similar to German boom and zoom tactics. The traditional Soviet emphasis on turning combat was supplemented with training in high-speed slashing attacks. This allowed Soviet pilots to exploit performance when available, while retaining turning capability when necessary. Senior Lieutenant is Ivan Kozudub, who became the highest-scoring Allied ace of World War II, demonstrated the effectiveness of this hybrid approach. He flew Yak fighters that retained Soviet protective features but used German-inspired tactics. His success, achieving 62 confirmed victories without being shot down, vindicated the Soviet approach of combining protection with improved performance and tactics. But there was a darker aspect to this technological competition. Hang in there. We're about to explore the human cost of these different design philosophies, and the numbers are sobering. The human cost of different design philosophies is difficult to calculate precisely, but essential to understanding the full implications of choices about fuel tank protection and other survivability features. Both approaches, German and Soviet, involved accepting casualties, but from different causes and with different philosophical justifications. German pilots flying FW-190s facing specific risks from the unprotected fuel system. When hit in the fuel tanks, survival was unlikely. The aluminum tanks would rupture, fuel would spray into the hot engine compartment, and catastrophic fire would result almost immediately. Pilots had seconds to bail out, and at low altitudes or in disadvantageous attitudes, even that wasn't possible. Oberleutnant Hermann Graf, who survived being shot down multiple times, described the terror of fuel system hits. When your fuel tank is hit, you know immediately. The engine begins running rough as it loses fuel pressure, and within seconds you see fire. In an FW-190, that fire spreads incredibly fast because there's no barrier between the fuel and the hot engine. You have perhaps 5 to 10 seconds to bail out before the fire reaches the cockpit. Several of my comrades died because they hesitated or couldn't get the canopy open quickly enough. The German casualties from fuel system fires were concentrated among less experienced pilots. Experienced pilots who maintained a tactical discipline rarely put themselves in positions where they would be hit, but new pilots, who inevitably made mistakes, were highly vulnerable. the unprotected fuel system was unforgiving of errors. A single tactical mistake could be fatal in ways that would have been survivable in an aircraft with protected fuel systems. Soviet pilots in aircraft with self-sealing tanks faced different risks. They were more likely to survive initial hits to fuel systems. The self-sealing bladders would contain fuel and prevent immediate fire. But the protection wasn't absolute. Sustained fire or large caliber hits would overwhelm self-sealing capability. And because Soviet aircraft generally had inferior performance, Soviet pilots were hit more frequently. The net result was that Soviet pilot casualties remained high despite protective features. They survived individual hits more often, but faced more hits overall. German casualties were lower in absolute terms, but when German aircraft were successfully engaged, the lack of protection made survival less likely. Captain Nikolai Golodnikov, a Soviet pilot who flew both early Yak fighters and later improved models, reflected on the psychological aspects. Flying an aircraft with self-sealing tanks provided psychological comfort. You knew that a single lucky shot wouldn't necessarily kill you. But that comfort was somewhat illusory. German pilots hit us frequently enough that protection only delayed the inevitable if we couldn't match their performance. The later aircraft that had both protection and better performance changed the calculation. Then protection became genuinely valuable because we could limit how often we were hit, while surviving hits that did occur. The ethical questions about design choices and pilot lives were rarely discussed openly during the war. Engineers and commanders made decisions they believed maximized overall effectiveness. Individual pilot survival was a factor, but not the only factor. Both German and Soviet approaches involved accepting that some pilots would die from causes that different design choices might have prevented. Post-war analysis attempted to quantify the trade-offs. A classified American study from 1947, examining German and Soviet fighter design philosophies, concluded that neither approach was clearly superior. The study found that German emphasis on performance produced better exchange ratios, but higher pilot losses per aircraft lost. Soviet emphasis on protection produced more pilot survivors, but lower overall effectiveness. The study recommended a balanced approach, incorporating both philosophies. So what's the final verdict on this design controversy? Let me give you the answer, and it's more nuanced than either side admitted during the war. The question of whether FW-190's unprotected fuel tanks represented a brilliant design choice or a reckless gamble doesn't have a simple answer. The reality is that both Soviet and German approaches were rational responses to different operational contexts, technological capabilities, and national priorities. The German approach was optimized for specific conditions. Limited pilot numbers, but generally high training quality, meant that experienced pilots could exploit performance advantages while avoiding situations where vulnerability mattered. Superior tactical doctrine and combat experience allowed German pilots to dictate engagement terms. Industrial capacity to produce high-performance engines and airframes made performance-oriented designs feasible. The Soviet approach was optimized for different conditions. Massive pilot training programs producing large numbers of pilots with variable skill levels meant that protection was essential because many pilots would make mistakes. Tactical doctrine still developing during early war years meant Soviet pilots couldn't always avoid unfavorable engagements. Industrial priorities emphasizing quantity over ultimate quality made extremely high-performance engines difficult to produce in required numbers. Neither approach was universally superior. Each worked within its specific context. The Soviet confusion when examining the FW-190's unprotected tanks reflected their assumption that their operational context was universal. They evaluated German design choices against Soviet requirements and found them incomprehensible. They didn't initially recognize that Germans were solving different problems. As the war progressed and Soviet aviation matured, the approaches converged. Soviet fighters incorporated performance improvements while retaining protection. German fighters added some protective features as pilot quality declined and tactical situations became less favorable. By 1944 and 1945, the distinction between design philosophies was less stark than in 1942 and 1943. The broader lesson extends beyond fuel tank protection. It's about recognizing that engineering optimization requires understanding the entire operational system. The best design isn't determined by abstract technical criteria, but by how effectively the design functions within specific tactical, operational, and strategic contexts. Kurt Tank, the FW-190's designer, defended his choices in post-war writings. The fuel tank decision was not careless. It was calculated. We determined that weight saved by eliminating self-sealing bladders could be invested in performance that would reduce hit probability more than self-sealing would reduce hit lethality. This calculation was correct for our operational context and tactical doctrine. Had we been designing for Soviet operational context, different choices would have been appropriate. Soviet designers eventually reached similar conclusions. Alexander Yakovlev wrote in his memoirs that examining the FW-190 was educational precisely because it demonstrated that Soviet assumptions weren't universal truths. Different contexts justify different engineering choices. The challenge is matching design to context, not identifying single optimal approach applicable everywhere. The transformation in Soviet thinking was profound. Engineers who had initially been certain that unprotected fuel tanks represented German incompetence eventually recognized it as a rational choice within German operational framework. This intellectual humility, the recognition that alternative approaches could be valid even when contradicting your own assumptions, represented important professional growth. Modern fighter aircraft design continues to grapple with these trade-offs. Contemporary fighters use various approaches to fuel system survivability. Some use advanced self-sealing materials. Some use fuel tank inerting systems that fill empty tank space with non-flammable gas. Some rely primarily on performance and defensive systems to avoid being hit. The debate that Soviet engineers began when examining that captured FW-190 in 1943 continues in modern form. The young Soviet engineers who stood in that freezing hangar in January 1943, staring at the FW-190's unprotected fuel tanks with confusion and concern, were confronting a profound lesson about the nature of engineering. They had assumed there was one correct way to design a fighter, the Soviet way, emphasizing protection even at performance cost. The German aircraft forced them to recognize that alternative philosophies could be equally valid within different contexts. That recognition, uncomfortable as it was, made Soviet aviation stronger. The willingness to learn from enemies, to question assumptions, and to incorporate lessons, even when politically inconvenient, characterized the best aspects of Soviet engineering culture. The improvements to Soviet fighters in 1944 and 1945, which finally achieved rough parity with German performance, resulted directly from lessons learned examining captured aircraft like that FW-190. If this story of engineering philosophy, wartime innovation, and the complex trade-offs between protection and performance captivated you, hit that subscribe button now for more untold stories from history's greatest technological competitions. Don't miss out on the next revelation.